Thanks, William. When I stand up to read poetry, as I have over the decades at Notre Dame, as a poet, I'm really quite arrogant. I mean, I think I'm very, very good. But I don't know. Tonight I feel rather like a fraud, especially with real live novelists in the audience. It's quite terrifying. The book is a kind of accidental insofar as after I finished an earlier book called Who Was Cousin Alice and Other Questions, I got a few letters from editors saying, these are interesting as narrative, and have you ever written fiction? And the answer to that was, kind of a qualified, yes, but 40 years ago. So I sat down and wrote something that was more or less fiction, and sent it to the editor who had asked to see it, and he liked it and was printed. And then some time passed, and I thought of another section about the same character, and then a third or fourth. And in the end, I stuck them all together, and what seemed to be missing was a glue of some sort to hold their episodes, really discrete episodes, in the life of my character, Timothy Westmont. And what I did in order to create the glue is to write a series of interchapters between each of the narrative bits, which in fact gives the book its title, called Different Kinds of Music. And the interchapters are about the different kinds of music that my character is listening to, or that is in the air in his culture, all the way from when he is born to more or less the present. In the first of the interchapters, he's riding a tricycle, and in the last of the interchapters, he's 80 years old. And these interchapters take in a bit of the social history of the period by way of its music. So I thought I could represent that by reading one of the shorter pieces and breaking it up with 3 of the interchapters. This is not the way this particular first short piece is printed, but it gives you an idea of the whole book, the way the interchapters interrupt the narrative chapters. And in the narratives, chronology is violated. In the first section, Timothy Westmont is middle-aged, and in the next one, he's about 12 years old, and in the one after that, he's about 16, and the one after that, he's about 65. But the interchapters are chronological, so it works as glue in that way too. You're reading an achronological sequence of episodes with chronological interchapters. Okay, this is the first story, called Westmont and the Teapot. And alas, it is a South Bend story, and it's even a neighborhood story, and I have friends from my neighborhood here. I even have my dentist here, I see, who is I hope I'm not going to intervene if I stumble and give me a root canal on that spot. But here we go. Timothy Westmont realized that he had managed to get his hand stuck in the teapot. He had taken it down from a high shelf and, as it had not been used for several years, was trying to dust out the inside with a small cloth. Then he found that he couldn't remove his hand. He was entertaining a representative of the Neighborhood Historic Association after a meeting at the City Hall, where he had been obliged to argue before a committee chaired by the architectural commissar, one Miss Angela Copstoner, Ph.D., that the charges against him for having restored his front porch columns with the wrong style of capitals should be dropped. Where there had been Scamozzi capitals before the storm, there were now Doric capitals. It had been a very unpleasant business. When the storm blew through the neighborhood, Westmont had been on the telephone with his doctor's secretary trying to obtain information about a recent medical test. Suddenly, the electricity all went off and there was a terrific crash at the front of the house. The telephone, however, continued working perfectly. The secretary was saying, "Well, you'll be glad to know that test turned out to be completely normal, Mr. Westmont." But Westmont was then shouting at her through the phone as if she had been responsible for what had just happened. "A big fucking tree just fell through my house and there's a huge limb filling up the entire living room." The secretary said, "Well, there's also a big fucking stain on your chart where I've spilled my coffee and the doctor would like to see you again in 6 months." Westmont put down the phone and surveyed the damage. A formerly tall limb of a large maple tree that had been standing in his front yard was now lying diagonally across his living room. All of the windows were broken and he had actually to climb over the limb in order to reach the door. A neighbor was already waiting there, concerned that Westmont might have been injured when the limb thrust itself through the window. He had not been hurt, he said. He had been on the phone in another room. The neighbor said goodbye and to let him know if he needed any help in cleaning things up. It was a good deal more complicated than cleaning things up. When Westmont's wife came home from work, she was appalled at the damage and immediately announced that her long-delayed trip to see her family in England would begin at once. She was on the phone to a travel agent even before Westmont could find the name of his home insurance company in the phone book. They spent the evening sitting on opposite sides of the great limb in the living room, talking about the house and their future together. Sally Westmont thought they needed some time apart. Would Westy mind a whole lot if he were left in charge of the repairs? While his wife talked on about the things he should do when she was away, Westmont was thinking about the time when he was 8 or 10, and an oak tree blew down in the backyard in Columbus, Ohio, where he had been born. He and his cousins played for days among the dying leaves, crawling up and down the limbs that jutted out at every imaginable angle into the sky and down into the ravine at the edge of the family property. They pretended they were lost on a capsized ship within sight of an island. "Ahoy, ahoy," they shouted. In the end, men came with saws and cut the capsized ship into firewood, which was stacked in the shed at the end of the yard. His father, who had pushed him on a swing tied to a nearly horizontal limb of the old oak, an experience that was one of Westmont's primal memories, lugged the pieces of wood into the house for years. It kept them warm through many a winter night. Westmont's wife was packed and gone within 48 hours. The Tarkington College steno pool, where she had worked for many years in a clerical capacity, had only recently awarded her some extra vacation time. As the Brandine Construction Company already had men working to realign the front door in its frame, she left by the broken window. Westmont passing the luggage behind her. "I'll call you from my sister's sometime tomorrow," she said. Westmont sat down miserably on the limb. During the 3 days it took before the limb was cut into pieces and removed from his living room, Westmont spent his evenings reading by candlelight. When leaves dropped from the smaller branches, he patiently gathered them up and put them in the trash. Then his wife phoned to say she was in London. She said he sounded odd. He felt odd, too. None of the downstairs lights in the house were working, he told her, and he was feeling depressed. She said she was sure the electric company would fix things up very soon. She was tired and jet-lagged and going to bed. Hanging up the phone, Westmont again surveyed his domain. He thought about the cost of all the repairs, the negotiations with insurance men. Brandine Construction had only agreed to fix the door and temporarily board up the broken windows until all of the insurance estimates were in, and they could make a formal bid. On the second day, while Westmont was out shopping for food, they cut through the tree's great trunk and took away the parts of it that had crashed through the roof and the porch. Because he wasn't home, and the door was locked securely in its repaired frame, and the windows were by then boarded up, they left the limb in his living room. That night he phoned his cousin in Denver. Did Richard remember the time when a great tree had fallen down in Columbus and all the cousins played on it for days pretending it was a sinking ship? Richard had no memory of this, but he hoped Westmont was well. They hadn't seen each other for many years. They really ought to get together one of these days. Interchapter. No lullabies that he remembered? Did anyone sing to him? Must have. His mother, Aunt Jean. One grandmother died before his birth, the other senile shortly after. So what music was first? He could only remember from his tricycle days, not from the days when he lay on his back and presumably saw a large something hanging over him that opened and shut. Did it sing? What he remembered was McNamara's band. That was his special tricycle music. Round and round the dining room table he'd go until the wind-up Victrola wound down. 78 RPMs, big brittle stack of them. He only liked McNamara's band. I could find it easily in the stack. He'd wind up the machine, put the raspy needle in the groove, and remount. Pedal, 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 then singing along. My name is McNamara, I'm the leader of the band, and though we're small in number, we're the best in all the land. When the drums go bang and the cymbals clang and the horns will blaze away, McCarthy puffs the old bassoon while Doyle the pipes will play. Oh, Hennessy, Tennessee toodles the flute, my word to something grand. A credit to old Ireland boys is McNamara's band. He loved it until he hated it. Loved it until he hated it so much that one day he took it off the machine and broke the record over his knee. His mother saw him do it. Westy, she said, why did you do that? He gave her a startled look and said, I didn't like it anymore. Westmont stood before the entirely unsympathetic jury at the City Hall. He had prepared a formal statement and was determined to read it. His wife was leaving him. He had been drinking for weeks. To make matters worse, he had caught a terrible cold from one of the Brandine Company carpenters who had come back to inspect his work on the new columns and smart Doric capitals that had been installed illegally, as it turned out, at their tops. The jury was made up of 3 Historic Preservation Commission members, 2 members of the Chamber of Commerce, and his neighborhood representative on the county council. He had, said Miss Copstoner, the chief of the Historic Commission's architectural police, replaced and destroyed the original Scamozzi capitals on his house. Scamozzi capitals had been made of local mud and horsehair and dated, the Historic Commission estimated, from the time the house was built in 1907. Westmont was responding to the charges. The work had cost him $3,000 more than the insurance company had paid Brandine and Company. The Historic Commission argued that the columns must be torn down and authentic replicas of the Scamozzis must replace the Doric capitals. In violation of a recent city ordinance, Westmont would have to pay. Westmont first said that as far as he was concerned, the so-called Scamozzi capitals were ionics, but they could agree to disagree about that. The point was that the story of all these repairs went all the way back to the storm in the fall of 2001, when a large tree fell on the left side of his porch at 840 Clark Avenue, destroying the ceramic capital on the left column as one faced the house and cracking all the others. He insisted that he must foreground this date because all the work on the capitals actually began as a result of the 2001 storm, and all his subsequent work was a response to that. He understood that he would eventually have to replace all the capitals, but could only get insurance to cover one at a time, the one that had crumbled into dust. This was all, of course, before the recent ordinance was passed, as was the start of the follow-up work that Joseph Brandine and Company began doing for him in July 2004. Homeowners Unite, as James Dickey wrote somewhere. Immediately after the storm, the entire porch roof had to be restored. Beginning in November of 2001, while work on some of the porch, including the capitals, was delayed until the spring of 2002, the delay was due to the difficulty of finding an appropriate capital. He could locate nothing ionic, OK, or Scamozzi, which he could afford until Brandine came up with a 10-inch diameter plaster replica, $274, which was finally installed. The plaster, however, looked nothing like the original clay and horsehair original. It appeared even from a distance to resemble a plastic imitation, a kind of Disneyland version of the real thing, and he disliked it from the beginning. All of the other ionics, Scamozzis, were, as he said, badly damaged. By the summer of 2004, they were porous and disintegrating, letting water into the columns, which had begun to rot from the inside out. Joe Brandine began looking for replacements for those in September 2004. The continuing work of restoration could be said to have begun at that time. Nothing that Brandine was able to find seemed to him satisfactory. He did not want to use the plaster imitations again, as he had come to dislike the one previously installed. There was some urgency that the work could get underway, but still he delayed beginning looking around until the summer of 2005. Homeowners Unite. As Westmont spoke, he slowly began to notice his surroundings. The old radiators hissed and steamed like those he remembered from his elementary school way back in the 1940s. The meeting room, in fact, resembled the school's Room 100, the largest gathering place in the building, where there were weekly all-school assemblies. This room had even more clanking and steaming radiators than the big classrooms, and he remembered liking to listen to the xylophone music they played and the hiss of the ill-matching pipes and fittings. Mrs. Swales, his fourth-grade teacher, would lead the singing, mostly patriotic songs, but also occasionally some rather subversive versions of what she called folk tunes, which were really written by living contemporaries like Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger, both banned from the OSU campus during those years. He never wondered in the fourth grade if Mrs. Swales was a lefty, but he suddenly wondered now, losing his place in the text. Interchapter. The music teacher, Miss Albert, liked Stephen Foster songs, and Westmont's class was asked to sing some of them every Tuesday and Thursday in music class. Many of them were about Negro slaves. Westmont found it all rather troubling, especially as his one good friend who wasn't Jewish, was black. Westmont especially hated singing Old Black Joe. His friend was called Joseph Black. True, no one ever called him Joe. He was always Joseph. Also, he didn't seem to mind the song himself. Along with everyone else, he belted it out with enthusiasm. Gone are the days when my heart was young and gay. Gone are my friends from the cotton fields away. Gone from the earth to a better land I know. I hear those darkies' voices calling Old Black Joe. Joseph grew up to be an honor student at an Eastern university and eventually a successful lawyer. When he decided to run for Congress, he started calling himself Joe. Those were the days of Jimmy Carter and a little later Bill Clinton. Now, if you're famous enough, you don't need a surname at all. Oprah, Madonna, Prince, and the rest of them. Granted, Bill or Jimmy or Joe wouldn't make the list of always already sufficient first names. But Westmont always called his old friend Joseph, even when he'd been elected to 3 terms from his Ohio district. Their long correspondence petered out because of distance or neglect on one side or the other. For Joseph, Westmont had always been Westy. But the letter he received, breaking a silence that lasted between 1982 and 1988, began, "Dear Westmont." Westmont hurriedly wrote back to his longtime friend, beginning, after thinking the matter through, "My dear old friend, Joe." Looking up, he apologized. Sitting at the table in front of him were those officials already indicated, but also an architectural historian brought in by Miss Copstoner. Westmont suddenly noticed that she was quite good looking. She gazed at him with what he took to be a sympathetic stare. But as he prepared to find his place and go on, he noticed that she had a withered right arm and a kind of a baby's hand at the end of it. He tried not to stare at it, but then realized that he had shifted his eyes to her breasts. She must not have been wearing a bra, as he could see her really quite marvelous nipples pressing against the sweater. Her businesslike jacket was unbuttoned, dropping straight from her shoulders. The word deformity formed on his lips. The whole of the porch, he said, was deformed. The winter of 2005 was an extremely difficult time for him. His wife had suddenly left for England after the initial storm in 2001, and she never returned. Once in England, she took up with an itinerant musician, and in 2005 filed for divorce. He himself had not been well, and he was able to do only those things necessary to get by. He supposed it was at some point in the winter that he missed the discussion of the new ordinance that was passed, he believed in April of 2005. At any rate, he was unfortunately unaware that forms needed to be filled out for the Historic Preservation Committee if he was going to make any changes in the capitals. If letters, brochures, or other information had been sent to him during this period, he was afraid he hadn't read them. He was focused on a major upheaval in his life, and he might possibly have thrown these missives away, considering them to be junk mail. While Joe Brandine continued to look for capital replacements, the existing capitals deteriorated further over the winter. Joe could not find Scamozzi capitals of the correct size. They would need to be made in 2 halves in order to fit around the tops of the columns. Full Scamozzi capitals could only be installed by removing columns from the porch and jacking up the porch roof, a complicated and expensive task. In the end, still unaware of the new ordinance, he decided to replace the Scamozzi with Doric capitals. He made this decision, he said, only after looking at all of the other houses up and down Clark Avenue, and especially at the 2 on either side of him, both of which had Doric capitals. On July 11th, 2005, Joe Brandine and Jeff Dierbeck were photographed by the Historic Preservation Society at work on, and he realized that the woman with the withered arm and hard nipples was asking him a question. "Mr. Westmont," she asked, "do you believe in history?" "What do you mean?" said Westmont, flustered. "Well," she smiled, "in preserving and honoring the past." "Of course," he said, "I'm a professional archivist at the college." "But not on the street?" "The street?" "Yes, on your Clark Avenue home turf, where you've knocked down 100-year-old Scamozzi capitals made of local mud and horsehair, an exceedingly rare example of typical Queen Anne ornamentation from the period around the turn of the century. In fact, they were the only surviving Scamozzis in the entire historic district. The abacus was beautifully formed, both the fillet and the chymna reversa, and so were the voltu, the embellished ekins with its unique egg and dart, the astragal, necking, and flute. And she held up a photograph for all to see. Westmont, feeling the effects of his cold and wiping his nose with a red handkerchief, hadn't quite taken in what she said. "I don't know about the embellished necking and eggs," he said. "My own point is that I know nothing at all about the ordinance until after the work was done. Otherwise, I would, of course, have filled out the forms." "Ah," she said, "ignorance of the law." Westmont went back to his statement. "I was about to mention the pictures," he said. "One of your agents arrived with the camera once work had begun. I think his name was Dane. This Dane began taking pictures and shouted out to the carpenter that he'd better stop what he was doing. I was inside and did not hear the exchange, so I'm not certain what was said on either side next. But the carpenter got in his car and drove off. The first I learned of the encounter was when Jeffrey Dierbeck of Brandine and Company phoned me to say that Dane and Miss Copstoner, who had been lurking under a tree, had frightened off their carpenter by telling him that he was in violation of the new city ordinance and would get a subpoena himself to appear before the body if he didn't cease and desist. The weathered harm done to my columns, but Westmont realized he'd said withered arm and paused. The weathered harm, this time he said it correctly, done to the columns had reached a point when Brandine and Dierbeck believed. "This is really all beside the point," Miss Copstoner said. "The only issue is whether you did or didn't replace the Scamozzis with something else. We even sent you our own estimates and plenty of options available from classic tops and trim as of September 17th, 2004. We mailed them out to you twice, along with information regarding how you might jack off your roof to install them at absolutely minimum cost." Westmont blew his nose. He was certain now that he had a fever, and of course, Miss Copstoner had said, "Jack up the roof, not jack it off," which is what he thought he had heard. He now began to ramble on about a crisis in his domestic life. "You don't really get it," he said. "My wife had left me with a tree in my house. Can you imagine how I felt? She just walked through the window and disappeared from my life, God damn it. She never liked this country very much. She's English, you see. She knows a good deal more than the commission about Queen Anne style, I can tell you that. Her brother-in-law's in the House of Lords. You ought to see her beating the members silly in chest. She castles her king and prompts her bishop and knight. If she were here, she'd make you ashamed of how you speak the language. Even when so, I'd comply with it in principle, that ordinance, I mean. It's just the work's already done. Moreover, since you've got to introduce photographs, I'd like to point out to you, you haven't got any pictures of the columns before 1926, 20 years after the house was built. There have also been plenty of changes over the years, including the addition of 2 full rooms at the back of the lot. Scrambozzis could have been addled at any point before 1926, say 1925, so maybe at the start there were Dorics. Even so, I did give all this a try. After the 12-inch Tuscan column caps from classic tears and strims, and stuff high-density modeled plastic wooden at the top additions, and we found the porch trailing also in a state of disrepair, and to reinforce the paint the same kind of time. Please see invoice for the work already done, $2,302. Please see also invoice estimate for cost of taking all that down and doing the Scamozzi over, $4,353. I am not barbarian or even out of sympathy with general aims of Historic Preservation Commission, but even ceramic cost prohibitive. I've spent a great deal of money. When I told my cousin Richard when the tree was in the house, he sadly said he'd forgotten how we played sinking ship on all those limbs and a big trunk that fell through the ravine. Ahoy! I don't suppose a single one of you has a spouse who left him through a window without giving notice, or have had to come back before a court like this feeling poorly and ought to be in bed. Westmont blew his nose and sat down dizzy. Miss Copstoner said that perhaps the commission had enough information and could adjourn until the next week's meeting. Interchapter. After a very stimulating spring term in advanced English seminar, taught by a student teacher substituting for Mr. Bateman, Westmont asked the assistant principal in the following fall term what had become of Mr. Glabb. It seemed that Mr. Glabb had graduated and was now teaching high school full-time in town. Westmont told the assistant principal, Mr. Jennings, how good a teacher Mr. Glabb had been. Better, he confided, than Mr. Bateman himself. All the boys, of course, called the latter Master Bateman behind his back. Mr. Jennings was a little surprised to hear this, but said he would tell Mr. Glabb what Westmont had said and pass along his good wishes. Within a few weeks, Westmont had a letter from Mr. Glabb. It was very formal, addressing him as Dear Mr. Westmont, and going on to talk at length about what he was teaching in his new school. At the end, he asked Westmont if he would like to meet for a cup of tea. Westmont had never been invited for a cup of tea by anyone, but eagerly wrote back to accept the invitation, where he asked in his reply, should they meet. In a few days, he got another letter suggesting the Broad Street coffee shop at a particular date and time. Westmont assumed that they must also serve tea there. Mr. Glabb included a phone number where he could be reached in order to confirm the meeting. Westmont phoned him the next day, and they agreed to meet in the late afternoon. When they spoke on the phone, Westmont could hear singing in the background. Mr. Glabb was fat, breathless, and had a badly repaired hair lip that had pulled his lower face into a kind of contorted shape. He was, in fact, so ugly that the students at Westmont's high school had been uniformly kind to him, always did their homework promptly, and certainly didn't make up names for him as they did with Mr. Bateman. In fact, it was generally agreed that Mr. Glabb was a good guy. He could even persuade them to read long novels like Moby Dick, which the students had another name for when Mr. Bateman taught it. Mr. Glabb looked around the classroom and said, I'm giving you access to something great here, something really great. Don't let me down. Westmont hadn't let him down. When they met, however, a good deal of time had passed. The tea at Broad Street coffee shop was a rather strange experience, as Westmont thought it could only be tea in a cup, but found himself with a mountain of little sandwiches and cakes to deal with. Also, Mr. Glabb almost immediately asked him if he'd like to attend an opera with him. It would be at the Cincinnati Zoo. Westmont thought that was a strange place for an opera, but Mr. Glabb explained that in fact the Cincinnati Zoo had the oldest opera, except for the Met, in the entire United States. Westmont wasn't sure what the Met was, or for that matter, what a company was. His father's law firm represented many companies, but this was clearly something else. They went to the opera together. It was La Traviata. During the longest drive to Cincinnati, Mr. Glabb explained the plot. He said the lead character was a courtesan, but didn't explain what that meant. He also explained something of the soprano's reputation. She was internationally known in that role. The opera house turned out indeed to be located in a zoo. It was an amphitheater with a roof, but with open sides, like Ravinia in Chicago. Westmont tried not to laugh when the seals started barking during arias. On the way back, Mr. Glabb put his hand on Westmont's knee. "Are you awake there, Mr. Westmont?" It had been Mr. Westmont all day long. He didn't know what to think. When they got back to Columbus, Mr. Glabb had left Westmont, where he'd asked to be left, even though it was very, very late. He knew his friends would be at Johnny's 402 Club listening to jazz. He asked Mr. Glabb if he'd like to come in and hear Ahmad Jamal, who was playing there with his trio. Mr. Glabb said that it was past the witching hour, but tried to give him a kiss when he got out of the car. Once inside Johnny's 402 Club, Westmont found his friends around a table at the back. Jamal was taking a break, so everyone was talking loudly. When he walked up to the table, his friend Joel, who had clearly had a few drinks, even though he was underage like everyone else, stuck a finger in Westmont's chest and said, "Westy's been to the opera with our former English teacher, Mr. Glabb." Everyone laughed as if this was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. David Goss said, "I also heard they'd gone to tea." Again, everyone cracked up. Paul Gerhardt said, "The opera, was it the magic fart?" "No," Westmont said, "it was La Traviata. Last year all you guys thought Mr. Glabb was cool." David Goss said, "Oh, that was last year." Conclusion. He had walked home with the architectural historian. His house was less than half a mile from the city hall, so he hadn't thought to drive. She too lived in the immediate neighborhood and said she was concerned about his health. Having regained his composure after he sat down in the meeting hall, Westmont thought that she was probably even more concerned about his state of mind. Anyway, he had appreciated the company. She seemed a nice enough lady, in spite of her having asked him sarcastically during the interrogation if he believed in history on the street. And she had told him as they walked along that her name was Jennifer Armstrong. When they reached his front door, Westmont was feeling better. Maybe it had been the heat in the county city building that had made him feel so ill and strange. Anyway, trying to make light of the issue between himself and the organization that Jennifer Armstrong worked for, he had said, "Are these the offending capitals? Doric capitals, classically austere. I like them." Jennifer had said she liked them too, but that her liking or disliking of them had nothing to do with the case against him. He was, she laughed, still a criminal in the eyes of the committee. As they stood rather awkwardly in front of the porch, which was still under repair, Westmont suddenly asked her if she'd like to share a pot of tea. Thanking him for the offer, Jennifer followed Westmont into his house and sat down comfortably on the sofa. At that point, Westmont almost immediately made a bad mistake. He said, "And that Copstoner woman, how can you work for such an irascible person?" "Oh, she's not so bad," Jennifer said. "In fact, she's my lover." And when Westmont looked embarrassed, she said, "You do look embarrassed." She shook the fist of her little hand on her withered arm and repeated, "You do, Mr. Timothy Westmont, look a little embarrassed." She gave him what the feminists had taught him to think of as a male gaze. Westmont awkwardly excused himself and went to the kitchen in order to make the tea. Reaching up on the top shelf, he lifted down his wife's favorite Victorian teapot, which he had not used since she left him, but thought Jennifer Armstrong might appreciate. Holding it under his left arm pressed against his side, he took a small dishcloth in his right hand and pushed both the cloth and his hand into the pot. He thought he should dust it out and then give it a good rinsing before putting in the boiling water and loose tea in the English fashion, or was it hot water first and afterwards the tea? But soon he was thinking about something else, even more urgently procedural than the question of whether the water or tea was first in the pot. He realized that his hand was stuck. Trying to make it as thin as possible inside the pot, he pulled and pulled until he'd begun to scrape the skin from the knuckle on his index finger. He tried running a little water from the tap around his wrist, but this made it worse. Then he tried a bit of cooking oil, then a little butter. Nothing seemed to help. And now the knuckle of his little finger was also skinned and beginning to bleed. He feared he was going to ask Jennifer for some assistance. As he walked into the living room with the teapot dangling from his right hand, Jennifer laughed, he thought sympathetically. "Oh my, Mr. Westmont," she said, "you seem to have got yourself in a bit of a pickle. Shall I give it a tug?" He held out the hand with the teapot on the end. "But first," she said, "do hold it up in the air for a moment." Westmont did so. "It looks," she said, "rather like a scamosi, or a somewhat wounded column. Can you hold it even higher?" "Aha," she said, "Statue of Liberty now. If you had a hand the size of mine, you could get in and out without any difficulty. You could get Mr. Westmont right to the bottom and out again. Perhaps we ought just to leave you like you are. Now let's see." But Westmont didn't want to see anything else. He realized at last that he was being mocked. He felt himself to be a victim of aggression. His nose was running badly, and he could only wipe it on his sleeve. "What are you up to?" he asked, alarmed. "Up to or down to?" she said. "Always down to business, Mr. Westmont. Always down to business. And you people who don't understand codes, you're always up to trouble. Up to no good. You think you can get away with murder." "Murder," he said. "It comes to that. You've murdered the historic happiness and smiling face of your own front porch. You are. But Westmont's landline was ringing in the other room, and he trotted in to answer it. It was his cousin Richard in Denver. Richard had called to chat. He said that he had remembered the day when the tree had fallen down in Columbus, and how all of the cousins had played on it just as Westmont had reminded him a while back. He said they were all getting old, and he thought it was important to share these things with others who remembered them, and that he was sorry he had forgotten the incident when they spoke about it some years before. He had realized that it was really a great moment in his childhood, part of a childhood idol that he shared with his brother Robert and Westmont and their cousin Jim. He said he had been even having a dream, but Westmont's cell phone was ringing in his jacket pocket. "Richard," he said, "my other phone is ringing. I've got to hang up. I've only got one hand." "Only got one hand," said Richard. "One hand," said Westmont. "I'll call you back." He managed to get the cell phone out of his left inside pocket with his left hand. Not an easy thing to do. It was his wife phoning from London. She had split up with her boyfriend and was having a hard time. In fact, she was completely broke and wondered if Westmont could manage a small loan. She promised she'd never ask for anything like this again, but things were quite desperate, and it was really urgent. Westmont said he had only one hand and would have to call her back. "Only one hand," she said. "What's happened to you, Westy?" He said, "There's someone here." He pressed disconnect. Westmont walked back into the living room with the teapot still dangling from his right hand. "Miss Armstrong," he said. But there was no one there.